Welcome everyone to my take on a speedrun series where the goal is to play against a Grandmaster and get a victory. As you can probably tell by my username, we're going to be starting off around 1100, as I think the 1000 to 2000 level is probably going to be the most educational for all of you. Now, I'm going to be running e4, d4 as my primary opening for white up until the 2000 level, and with black, I'm just going to be playing symmetrical and principled moves, so like in response to e4, I would play e5. Okay, so here, as I just mentioned, I'm going to be playing the move pawn to d4, immediately challenging the black pawn in the center, trying to get them to capture here. And my idea is that I want to play pawn to c3, sacrificing this pawn and then getting extra development with my knight. So now I can bring out the bishops freely, bring out the knights, and my opponent is lacking development. Also, I'm going to be looking at the moves from my opponent and trying to explain where they might be going wrong or what they're doing well. In this situation, pawn c6 is a bit of a mistake. They want to go for pawn to d5, but it does get stopped pretty directly by bishop c4, and instead they should be prioritizing the development of their other pieces. Queen f6 is another mistake because now the queen is potentially vulnerable, especially after my knight comes out and the bishop might be able to develop over to g5. So I'm just going to continue developing my knights and bishops. Generally, you wanted to put the knights out before the bishops, but as you'll see, I put my bishop on c4 because it had a concrete reason that I wanted to stop the pawn going to d5. They're technically threatening to capture my knight here, but it's not a huge deal. You can oftentimes lose this pawn, and I think I'm just going to castle, and I'm going to show how going pawn hunting in the opening is generally not a good idea. Okay, so we capture like this, and they are attacking my rook and my bishop, but we're up so much development at this point that my opponent might be about to get in some pretty serious trouble. Already I'm looking at moves like queen to d6, which can pair up with bishop to a3 in order to go for a checkmate on the black king here, because they've traded off their dark squared bishop and could land in serious trouble. After queen to d6, we need to look at, okay, if they take my rook, then we just follow up bishop to a3, and there's now a checkmate threat on black, and the queen is under attack, and the queen will have no way to return to defend the black king. If we go queen to d6 and they capture my bishop here, then once again bishop to a3 looks pretty dangerous. They can't just develop their knight and defend f8 because then we will checkmate them on e7 because the knight is guarding that square. And other than that, all of their pieces are so undeveloped and passive that I don't think they have time to capture my bishop. So let's calculate it one more time. Queen goes to d6, queen captures the bishop, bishop to a3, and the queen on c4 doesn't have a good way to go back and defend f8. So maybe we can try and look what happens if they play king to d8. Well, then we can try and follow up with maybe queen to f8, king to c7, bishop to d6, king to b6, and try and look for some king hunt there. But maybe it would be a little bit more accurate first to play rook to b1. Although, at the very least in that line, you can see that we'd be able to capture the bishop here and also try and go for this b7 pawn, so we'll be reclaiming our material. The opponent takes the rook in the corner, but I think that allows us to play bishop to a3, now threatening the checkmate. As you can see, all they've moved around is the queen, but we're going for the king, and we're not going to miss this time because queen f8 is pretty much unstoppable unless you want to lose your queen, because that is also under attack. So pretty short attacking game here. Yep, they play knight f6, but as we said before, that now stops defending e7. So queen e7 is a checkmate. Good game to my opponent. Let's take a look at the analysis. Okay, wow. So we did play that game at a 99.4 accuracy. Obviously, the opponent made some errors in terms of following the principles that game. And yeah, but it's not too surprising that we had a high accuracy because we just did everything normally, made a couple of sacrifices while way ahead in development, but I didn't even have to calculate it that much because intuitively, I just knew that what we were doing was correct, and you can't really get away with developing your queen so early on. So, like I mentioned earlier on, we are playing e4, d4, sacrificing this pawn, playing c3. And the reason you're doing this is because you want to get the knight out early. So now we have an extra development tempi over black. So white's already up 1 tempi, but now we have a pawn in the center and a knight developed before black can even get anything out. As well as that, for sacrificing the pawn, we have nice open lanes for the bishops to develop, and the rook can come to the c-file. So all in all, a lot of free space for the pieces to move around. I mentioned this in the game, but c6 is a mistake because you cannot move the knight to c6 anymore, which is a very natural development square for the knight. And if you can't develop the knight and you can't develop the bishop, then you can't develop the rook, which means you can't develop the queen side. So much more natural for black would be something like knight to c6, followed by some d6, maybe bishop develops out, knight gets out, you can castle like this, and that might have been a better way for black to continue. But instead we saw pawn to c6, the bishop comes out to c4, queen comes out to f6. This is another mistake because you're removing the f6 square from your knight to develop. So you can see that black has got rid of both the c6 and f6 squares for their knights. Both of the natural squares are now gone. And after we finish developing with our knight, they try and play bishop to b4, getting greedy and trying to win a pawn here. A slightly more passive approach would have been something like bishop to d2. There's nothing really wrong with this because, of course, if they want to capture, then we'll get this bishop to a nice diagonal. But if castling's a good move here, then it's definitely what you should go for, because that way you can reserve the bishop for something more active. And if the opponent wants to dive in the deep end and try and win a free pawn, then they can often end up in serious trouble. Let's turn on the analysis here. At this point, the engine is already giving plus 4.5 for white, completely winning advantage after the move queen to d6, which is given a double exclamation mark. Thank you very much, chess.com. And the point is, of course, that you cannot take either piece because bishop to a3 is coming and you're getting mated on the dark squares, having just given up your dark squared bishop. We saw what happened after black took the rook. We just played bishop to a3 and then they were getting mated. Apparently this is a forced mate in 8, but of course you don't have to see that. But if black took the bishop, which was slightly more resilient, then we could play bishop to a3. We looked at king to d8. Apparently c5 is the best move here, but it doesn't look too much better. Oh, because the engine wants to just give up a queen. That's not very impressive. But engine wants to give up a queen with pawn to c5. We looked at king to d8, which is really the only active try to try and keep the material and not get checkmated. But then we calculated queen to f8, king going to c7. We looked at bishop to d6 here, king moves, and decided that if we wanted to, we could just grab the bishop here. But also, even better is to deliver this check first, get the king to move, and then grab the bishop, because then we can take b7 with a check. But even without seeing all of these calculations, you should be able to understand intuitively that with the queen on d6 and bishop lining up on a3, these dark squares are going to be super weak, and black simply doesn't have time to go material hunting with the queen. Probably what black should have tried here was something like queen to f6, attempting to get the queens off the board considering they're up material, but then we can continue to invade with queen to c7, and this bishop actually can't be defended, because if you go queen to d8, I'll give you a few seconds to try and figure out the tactic, but of course it's bishop takes on f7. This is a pretty common motif in this opening. We're taking the pawn on f7 to deflect the king away from the queen, and then win a full queen, collect the bishop, probably grab the pawn and the rook. If the king tries to maintain contact here, then we can play not bishop to g5, because then there's knight to f6 and it's unclear, but instead bishop to a3, because d6 is not possible due to the pin, and if they play c5, it's just bishop takes on c5, king has to move, and finally, we could take the queen, but we could also deliver a mate in 1 with queen to f4. That's pretty brutal. Look at this bishop taking away the squares, this bishop taking away the squares, knight also assisting, and I think that's a pretty nice checkmate to leave the video. I hope you enjoyed this one. Hopefully this inspired you to play some attacking chess with this e4 d4 gambit setup, and I will be back with another video shortly. See ya!